Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today for this event. I'm super proud that this thing got off the ground, and it's a team effort, but we saved the sentimentality for the end of it. Welcome to Understanding a Broken System, part 1 of 2 events on criminal justice. Before I do anything else, let me first say for those attendees who will need interpreters, we have 2 with us. We have Angela and we have Jessica. So what you should probably do is find their sort of screen on the gallery view you should see, and try and pin their screen so that you can always get the feed to them. Yeah, great. So wonderful. I just wanted to do that before. Also, of course, we're using Zoom today. Thank you for doing another Zoom thing with us voluntarily. So that means for this event, your cameras will be off along with your ability to speak. If you have, well, later during the Q&A portion, you're going to use the actual Q&A tab within Zoom at the bottom to ask questions of the panelists. We will use the chat function for any technical issues. So if you have a question during the Q&A portion, please don't put it in the chat, which we'll just keep for text stuff. Please go ahead and put it in the Q&A bit. Wonderful. Also, there are some glitches that have been coming up with Zoom, as we understand. If you're using Zoom just through your browser and not the downloaded app, it might inhibit your ability to participate later. We'll see. And if you're using an older version of Zoom, that could also make things a little harder for you. So just things to be like aware of. If possible, maybe upgrade them if you wanted to go ahead and participate. I'm so sorry. Let me just, I'm getting a message. And very good. Yes, so we have those 2 tech issues to be on the lookout for. I should probably just be transparent with everybody, right? Because in the vein of like student government, my Wi-Fi has been like a super big issue. Obviously, small house, I share a room with my brother, so there's really no place for me to like host this besides school, and I wasn't able to get there today. So currently my brother has my phone. So support crew, if you have anything to tell me, please go ahead and put it in the chat for me to see. I apologize for that not being clear before, but I had to like solve the issue real quick before. Anyway, in the vein of transparency, let's dive into this event. What is it about? It's the first half of a 2-part series. Tomorrow is the second half, and that's where we really wanted to center the student voice so we can tangibly figure out what AS can do in this moment, in this movement, right, against institutionalized police brutality or discrimination otherwise in this country. And really a place where we can begin that dialogue to reimagine what public safety looks like here. But that's tomorrow. Today, I wanted to give you some background. Why does this exist? And it was conceived because, you know, as AS, which is your student government here, we represent your official voice, on paper at least. And insofar as that, we believe we have a responsibility to respond to this. But the problem then arises that none of us are experts in this subject. Of course, if you are familiar with the Senate, we represent colleges across the university, so it could be things that don't directly deal with social justice. Sorry, again, I'm trying to do a few things right here. So if you see me pause, I apologize in advance, but I'm still with you, don't worry. 3, with our limited energies, we want to know what's most efficient for us to go after an attack. So that's why we have an event like this. It's to solve for that issue of we aren't experts in this, and we're just trying to do this the best we can, given the fact that we're also full-time students. So we have professors today across 7 academic departments. We have 1 more joining us later. And I hope everybody today can walk away with some well-rounded knowledge on some of the debates happening right now, but also maybe some tangible areas we can focus our efforts to. So that's the background, right? Like, I also want to give you the specific intentions for this meeting, so everybody is super clear on what we hope to get out of this as AS student leadership. It's one, for us as student leadership to do a better job at representing you, because we always hear that that's a need, of course. Two, it's for us to, in this process of educating ourselves on the subject, it's for us to do this publicly and transparently, so you see where we're getting our information from. Three, it's so that we as student leadership can actually learn together with the rest of the campus, which I think is a really beautiful thing. Four, it's to start that productive dialogue that can engage the campus as a sort of unified entity, right, towards coalescing our shared power together. So of course, out of that, producing tangible action is a super high priority. And then lastly, what really guides our whole thinking on this is producing a resolution out of it, talking about tangible action. And for those that don't know, it's fine. A resolution in our AS student government is basically just says, this is the official stance of the student government / student body on something. And it really just opens up more possibilities for us to lobby and be active in the struggle in the future. For example, we passed one earlier in this, during this summer, during our first Senate meeting, which I think helped us provide an event like this. So boom, hopefully that's everything you need to know about the intentions. Let's run down this event right now. First, we'll have our lovely panel of esteemed CSUN geniuses introduce themselves. And I'm truly super appreciative that they could all be here with us today. And after they introduce themselves, they'll go ahead and get into the meat of the program, which is sharing their thoughts on criminal justice broadly, however they want to speak to it as their expertise lends itself. And then in the next portion, in the spirit of debate, we'll allow a section for professors to respond or follow up on ideas expressed in the earlier portion. To continue to center students in this learning, we're going to have the next section be where students can ask questions, which is what I sort of referenced earlier. That'll be about half an hour. We'll use the Q&A function for that. And then after that, after we exchange all these ideas and professors hopefully can provide us with some parting thoughts around the subject, to summarize what's most crucial in moving forward. And they can also touch on any readings or any follow-up material they think you should be privy to. But don't worry if you don't have a notebook to get that down with, because we've asked them to provide us with a list, and we'll make that available on the AS website in the coming month. And again, we're looking at about 2.5 hours, but we'll really just kind of see and feel how this thing goes. It may go quite differently. And I can go no further, of course, without grounding what we want to do in a sort of the intention of respect. I want to ground our interactions today with respect. This shouldn't really be so much a problem today, but still, I just want to establish, hopefully, what we can expect of each other as students. Hopefully, we can listen to each other and be empathetic to each other's similar humanity, right? We hope this event displays the best of us as CSUN, so that we're contesting ideas and as opposed to maybe attacking the person that they are coming from. And we're also not going to tolerate hate or discrimination and a speech that seeks to incite, troll, or threaten otherwise. And we will mute you if we see that happening. Cool. So that's the event. We are going to move now into the introductions from the professors. I was going to do this at first, but then I realized, no, it probably makes more sense if I have the professors introduce themselves. To avoid any awkward transitions, I'll stay on top of this, and so that means I'll introduce this professor briefly. I'll say, "Hey, it's your turn," and then I'll say thank you afterwards, and then I'll go to the next professor. Here again, professors can kind of share a little bit about maybe who they are, maybe their academic backgrounds, really whatever they want, what interests them in this work maybe. And this is, again, not the portion where we're diving into the ideas outright, but if the professors do feel like they have time to kind of give a preview about it, they can do that as well. So let me go ahead and first read off the order of professors that I established for today, just to make sure it's conceptually clear for everyone. We'll begin with Professor Escobar of Chicano and Chicana Studies. After that, we'll hear from Professor Lai of Asian American Studies. After that, we'll hear from Professor Lorenz of Criminology and Justice Studies. After that, also of criminology, we'll have Professor Labertoo. After that, we'll have Professor Hogan-esque from political science. After that, we'll have Professor Graves, but I believe he'll be late. He's from geography. After that, we'll have Professor Paez. And after that, we'll have Professor Olmos. I'm really like super excited. We have like 8 professors, like all pretty much from different things. So let's actually go ahead and jump into this. Professors, once I call on you, feel free to unmute yourself. Let's go ahead and begin with Professor Escobar.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you everybody for organizing this really important and meaningful event. My name is Marta Escobar. I'm faculty in Chicano Studies. I am, my work focuses on issues of criminalization, incarceration, prisons, detention centers, especially as they relate to immigrant women, Latina immigrant women. We just started Project Rebound on campus, and so that is a resource for formerly incarcerated students. And so the idea is to create community on campus because LA has the largest jail system in the world. California incarcerates for a long time. It led incarceration across the nation. And so there's a lot of people impacted by those issues in this area. And so the idea is to provide a space, a community for folks to process and to understand issues of incarceration and to provide some resources for students. So if anybody is formerly incarcerated or you know folks, please, I'll put the email for Project Rebound in the chat in a minute. I'm also part of the Educational Equity Committee for Faculty Senate. And so, you know, looking at issues of educational equity, right? What does that look like? Why is it that CSUN has 75% students of color, but like 63% white faculty? You know, those inequities, how do we address them? And so those are some of the questions that we're gonna take up through the EEC this year, hopefully. I'm part of the Center for the Study of the People of the Americas, and so CESPA, and we specifically focus on education and empowerment for Latinx, Chicanx communities. And so we do a lot of programming around that. Civil discourse and social change, that was the first, in addition to my department, the first place that became home for me on campus, really providing a space for faculty of color to build community, to access resources, to navigate the campus. So I'm really grateful to them. I'm first generation. I'm the first one in my family, extended family, immediate family, all of it. I come from an immigrant background. Growing up, it was mixed status. Some of us were undocumented, legal residents, some citizens. And so always dealing with issues of border and the border patrol and whether people made it across the border safely or not. Growing up in that kind of context, we understood that you don't call the police, right? The state is not there to provide safety for you. Right? We understood, we never called the police. That wasn't something that we would do. And in part it had to do because of our immigrant experiences, right? The state represented violence to us. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I was a student organizer at UC Riverside. And in 2000, I got involved with Proposition 21, which criminalized young men of color as gang members. And that's where I started doing work around prisons. And I've been doing that ever since. So thank you so much, everyone. Looking forward to the conversation.
I'm so happy Professor Escobar is here with us. She also helped me figure out how I'd structure this event a little bit. So I just want to say thank you again, and also super important educator involved in the No Executive Order Coalition, which I was happy to sort of participate in a few years ago. And we'll also hear from now Professor Lai.
Hi, everyone. My name is Clem Lai. I'm a professor of Asian American Studies. My background is actually in geography and also in ethnic studies. So my PhD is in ethnic studies and my master's is in geography. So what does that mean? That means I study space and I look at political movements and the importance of space to political movements. When I was at grad school at UC Berkeley, I trained with Ruthie Gilmore, who is now at CUNY Graduate Center as one of the foremost scholars and activists working on issues of incarceration and abolition. of the prison industrial complex. And so here at CSUN, I always teach about incarceration as part of my classes because I think it's a good way to understand how racism operates today and in a very spatial way, right? And I think it's also a great way to teach about liberation movements. And so that shows up in a lot of my classes. In addition to being a professor of Asian American Studies, I am the director of a minor in the College of Humanities called Civic and Community Engagement, and that just involves a lot of social justice and service learning opportunities for the students who are in the minor. And I'm also currently one of the co-directors of Civil Discourse and Social Change. So I wear a bunch of different hats, but this year, Civil Discourse and Social Change, one of the its key focus is going to be on issues of immigrant detention and deportation, and focusing, in part on the Asian American community, and that's why I'm here today, is to comment a little bit on that. But you should look forward to programming that we're having throughout the year. A bunch of this program is actually funded by the California Civil Liberties Public Education Fund, and that's a grant that's available to remember the Japanese and Japanese American incarceration during World War II, and also other civil liberties violations in California U.S. history. And I think that's all I want to have to say right now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Professor Lai. Also a excellent photographer. It's true. It's true. Cool. Thank you. Let's go ahead and hear from Professor Lorenz.
Hey everyone, my name's Katherine Lorenz. I'm an assistant professor in the Criminology and Justice Studies department. This is going on my third year at CSUN. In that department, I teach courses primarily focusing around victimology, domestic abuse, sexual violence, and research methods. Outside of teaching, I'm a sexual violence scholar, so much of my work is focusing on the experiences of survivors following the assault. So things like deciding to report to the police, deciding to disclose to someone informally, telling a friend, family member, or a romantic partner about the abuse they experienced, and how that connects to recovery based on the social support and social reactions provided by the person that they report or disclose to. So what that means is, how do the police respond? What are people's experiences with the legal system? How do workplaces provide support to survivors when they need time off to recover or seek services or go through or navigate the legal system? How do universities respond to survivors? Things like that. And then outside of teaching and research, I try to do things in the community, working for different organizations that are geared toward providing support to survivors, but also addressing structural and discriminatory barriers faced by survivors, and also like exploring alternatives for support and justice outside of the legal system. So that's how I'm approaching today's panel. I'm going to talk about sexual violence and how our legal system and police can perpetuate harm to survivors following the assault.
Thank you so much. No, I mean, that's incredible, and I'm very fortunate. This is the first time I'm meeting Professor Lorenz, so I'm very fortunate to have her with us today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Yay! Perfect, cool. Let's go ahead and hear now from also Criminology and Justice Studies, Professor Labertoo.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Denise Labertoo. I am a lecturer here at CSUN, and probably even more proud of the fact that I was also a student here, an alumnus of CSUN, of both the sociology departments and the newly birthed, what's now Gender and Women's Studies, but was then Women's Studies program when I graduated. And so I spent, Professor Lorenz and I probably should have spent a little bit of time talking about how we were going to approach today, but I think that based on our expertise, we both teach courses in victimology. We both have significant amount of expertise around victimization, and also the ways in which that experience of victimization intersects with criminal justice systems. And so, but I did, because I want to focus a little bit also in my time, my 2 minutes that I get, on understanding what that means in terms of intersectionality. So I want to acknowledge, as part of this discussion in my introduction, the reality of the use of my whiteness and cis femaleness, right, by the community at large, to promote in many ways and sustain racialized state violence. And so I think that that's a really critical sort of thing to say in this context, because certainly I try to be an ally, and even beyond that, right, an accomplice in sort of tearing down some of these systems. But we can't get away from the fact that that whiteness and cis femaleness has been used pretty consistently to target folks for intentional harm around this state violence issue. And so I wanted to say that. And so I certainly come to this space being part of the community learning, certainly have some expertise, but also I spent 25 years in victim advocacy, working very intricately in criminal justice systems with victims all over the world. And I'm excited to be part of this community learning experience, because certainly, and I want to go back to where Michael started, this whole discussion about hearing from experts. I mean, the reality is that each of us has our expertise, but none of us really is an expert in this completely, because we're really on a new path as we start thinking about what it could mean.
Thank you for that, Professor, and also really addressing that sort of, elephant in the room too. I really appreciate you doing that. Also, the first time I'm meeting you. So thank you for that, Professor. Let's go ahead and hear now from a professor I've actually had in political science, Professor Hoganesk.
Afternoon, guys, and thanks to you, Mike, and AS and support staff, and particularly the students who are out there on, gosh, I don't even know what day it is today, Thursday. Another Zoom session. You guys are going to be the activists. You guys are going to be the ones pushing for the change. So a tip of the hat to you. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'll just tell you about how I got interested in studying policing in Los Angeles. I was a young 20-year-old transfer student to USC back in the fall of 1988. I was living on Adams Boulevard. I don't know if you guys know that area, but it's kind of gritty today and a lot grittier back in the late 80s. And most of the people in my neighborhood were low income, either immigrants or African American. And then here I am going to school with all these rich kids from Orange County. My dad was a professor there. That's the big reason why I was going to USC. And I was just shocked by Los Angeles. I had never been to California before even. And I was shocked by the inequality that I saw around me every day. And I still am, how many years later, that Los Angeles is like the epicenter of, some of the problems, the big problems with capitalism and inequality. And I remember in the fall of '88, it was around Halloween, and a 12-year-old boy was shot in front of the house where I was living in a volley of bullets. And I remember for weeks seeing his bike covered with flowers, and then emerging the details. It was the familiar story, as we thought he had a gun, this 12-year-old boy, and it turned out to be a flashlight. And I just was completely shocked by Los Angeles. And I was a political science major, and I knew enough about the field to know that, inequality doesn't lead to good outcomes in society, and particularly if police and community relations are going to be bad. And sure enough, about a year later, we had the Los Angeles riots. which was a major catalyst for reform of LAPD. And for me, just being a kind of a new person to Los Angeles, kind of pushed me to the study of policing and really all things LA, and I'm still at it here 20 years later.
Thank you for that, Professor. I didn't even, I had never heard that story before, and I forget too that you're not, like, you haven't always been from LA. And it's, yeah, it tells you something, right? That you saw those things back then, and it's still like consistent. The issues are consistent. So anyway, thank you, Professor. Really excited to hear your contribution. We would have gone to our Professor Graves, but he made me aware beforehand that he has a class right now. He's actually trying to get out of early just for us. So I feel like really fortunate. We'll go ahead. And,
have you noticed I'm here?
Oh my God, Professor Graves! I'm so sorry. See, I have my screen split, so I can't. Hey, hi! Please introduce yourself. Thanks for joining us. You're the very first professor to respond to my outreach. Thank you.
Speak of the devil, and he appears. You know, that's what timing.
I'm so happy you interrupted me. Thank you too. I really would like not have known.
I was just in my stats class, and boy, teaching software in this environment, oh my God, it's a nightmare. Anyway, I won't complain about that. My introduction, I'm in the geography department, and I teach a crime geography class. I've got a few publications in crime geography. I'm probably more interested in how the landscape, the built landscape, affects crime rates. So liquor stores, parks, payday loan shops, that kind of stuff that has an effect on crime rates in neighborhoods, or appears to at least. And then I published something just last year on the spatial pattern of officer-involved shootings in Los Angeles County. So looking at LAPD and LA Sheriff data, and found that, well, I didn't find what I thought I was going to find. I thought that we would find far more officer-involved shootings in communities of color. And though that is true, once you accounted for the crime rate, it didn't line up that way, which is what I thought, was that even after you account for the local violent crime rate, that say the Crenshaw district would have a much higher rate of officer-involved shootings. But that wasn't the case. In fact, the Crenshaw district had, compared to its crime rate, relatively few officer-involved shootings, whereas, say, North Hollywood had an abundance of them. And so race or ethnicity didn't show up nearly as important. Particularly African-American. Percent Hispanic did seem to elevate it some, but that was mostly because the East LA Sheriff Division had an unusually high rate of officer-involved shootings, given the crime rate over there. So that's, you know, that's kind of what I do. Broken windows, I'm also very interested in that, because it's very geographic sort of thing. So that's my 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Professor Graves. I'm finally taking a geography class because I want to teach social science, and you kind of need to know geography to teach it, and it's been a blast. So I'm really happy to have your thing accounted for. Let's go ahead and hear from Professor Paez now.
Hello, Chela, Jose Miguel Paez, Wa Nishi. Hello, my name is Jose Miguel Paez. My gender pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a mixed race ethnic person. My mother's family is from Mexico and Italy, and my father was born in the Philippines and is a Native American. We are, or Siletz Indian. We are enrolled members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, which is located in Oregon. And before I go any further, I just wanted to take a moment to begin this space in a good way. By acknowledging and honoring the Sesed Bitam the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of the Sesa Venga that is now occupied by our institution, CSUN, and also to honor their elders, past and present, and the Sesa Vitam descendants who are citizens of the Fernandinho Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. And we want to recognize that the Sesa Vitam are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. And I apologize if I'm not saying their name totally correctly, but I also want to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people to the south, and to the west, the Chumash peoples who have been living and working on these lands from time immemorial. And I also want to take a moment so that people want to learn more about the Tataviam tribe in the chat. I'll put a couple of links here so that you can learn more about what they're doing, their actions, the way that they're reclaiming their land and restoring their sovereignty and maintaining their sovereignty. And in addition to that, I also want to acknowledge the countless numbers of Black families who endured the violence and cruelty and barbarity of 100 years of enslavement, and whose labor was exploited to generate massive wealth and the economic structures that many of us benefit from today. So their lives matter and Black lives matter. Let's remember also all the activism, resistance, creativity, and resilience of Black and Indigenous people whose knowledge, courage, and innumerable contributions have given us hope, strength, and love. And their efforts have always been at the forefront of social justice movements for liberation and freedom. I'm a teacher in the social work department. I've been a teacher here, this is my 12th year. I was a full-time lecturer for the last 11 years, and I just recently completed my doctorate, my EDD here at CSUN, which is a huge honor. And now I'm transitioning into an assistant professor position in the social work department. But it's an honor to be in this space with you all and to discuss this topic today. So thank you for inviting me.
Oh my gosh, no, thank you for being here with us, and thank you for grounding this in how you introduced it about the Native peoples here, and your background is super fascinating. Congratulations too. Let's go ahead and hear from Professor Olmos to round us off.
How's it going, folks? So my name is Professor Daniel Olmos. I am a faculty member, assistant professor in the Department of Sociology. I actually grew up in the San Fernando Valley, around the corner. I went to James Monroe High School, which is really close by to CSUN. So I'm really familiar with Los Angeles and in the Valley in particular. I got my PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm really happy to be here back in the Valley teaching and doing research. I teach courses around race, racism, urbanism, immigration, globalization. And I do research around issues related to urban society and how state power attempts to control racialized populations that create inequality in the labor market or segmented labor markets. And so some of the cases that I look at, for example, were banning of leaf blowers, the banning of street vendors, and a variety of other forms of state control of immigrant populations. So I'm really interested in the relationship between police power and economic relationships in the city. And so I'm really privileged to be here, and I'm looking forward to this really great conversation.
I'm very happy to hear Valley stuff all the time, 818 for sure, and Monroe is not too far. Nobody knows what high school I went to, but it's close to Granada Hills Charter. So let me just say, and a lot of our teachers used to teach at Monroe. Anyway, Valley out here. Very cool. Thank you, Professor Olmos. Let's go ahead and transition into the next phase, which is the meat of our afternoon together. The professors will have approximately 5 minutes apiece to delve into what they wanted to speak on. They already sort of touched on it. You know what, actually, before I go into that, I made a couple of notes that I forgot to go into. Of course, this brings up histories and stuff like that. So, oh, I'm so sorry. My audio went out. Can you hear me out? I'm back. Oh, Lord help us. Very good. I just want to say trigger warning, everybody. I know this is a very intense topic and it brings up a lot of personal histories for people. So definitely, if you find you may be overwhelmed by it, don't be afraid to log out or watch this later. Don't worry. it's being recorded also, and we'll post it to the AS website before too long. So no, there's also that. And I forgot to introduce myself. I've just been a nameless moderator this whole time. My name is Michael. I am the Senate representative of humanities, I guess, and I major in political science and religious studies. I'm due to graduate in December. So anyway, I was going to transition us into our next big article, which is professors have 5 minutes apiece to delve into what they wanted to go into. And then if you are like an attendee watching, maybe like don't be afraid to take a note if you wanted to ask a question for the next portion. And also professors, you'll have a section to kind of respond to ideas. So you may also want to just keep that in mind. But we'll go ahead and start from the top of our list again, hearing from Professor Escobar. And don't worry, I'll also kind of be roughly timing you, and I'll put it in the chat once you're kind of at maybe a minute, 2 minutes and a half, and then you'll see what I do. Anyway, Professor Escobar, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm also going to give myself a timer because I'm bad at keeping track of chat, as my students now know. So I wanted to talk about abolition, right? Right now, defund the police is a big movement that is out there. But before this, there's been a movement around prison and jail abolition for a long time. For me, my introduction, as I said when I introduced myself, was as an undergraduate student back in 2000 with the Proposition 21. But people had already been, there was a big conference that was held in 1998 up north in the Bay Area of folks concerned about the expansion of incarceration, of jailing, and they decided to get together. They expected about 500 people to show up. I think they ended up having 3,000 people show up, right? And so that's where Critical Resistance comes from. And Critical Resistance is a community organization dedicated to fighting against incarceration. And they're really the ones that help theorize the concept of the prison industrial complex, the idea that there's a state, there's economics mixed in with processes of incarceration. And so I think for us, it's really important to begin there because that's where we begin to understand the role of incarceration and jailing in constructing US society. So most of us have watched the film 13th, right? And the premise of the film, if you haven't watched it, watch it. But the premise is we're looking at the 13th Amendment, right? And the 13th Amendment, everybody believes, abolished slavery. And the critique that W.E.B. Du Bois made, I believe it was 1935, his book on Reconstruction, and then that Angela Davis drew from to make her critique of prisons is that what we saw in terms of slavery was not the end of slavery, but the transformation of slavery, right? So that people that had recently been freed from slavery were then criminalized, their life conditions were criminalized. So you start seeing from slave codes to Black codes, right? Where the life conditions of Black people become crimes. So you have, in some areas, you have where it's now anti-vagrancy laws, where now you can be criminalized for not being at work or being houseless or not being in school, right? And so you have a recently freed population that now, and in many areas, it was also illegal to rent or sell to those folks. So you make being Black a crime in some of these, in some parts of the South, right? And so what we start seeing is the expansion of jailing in response to those bodies, right? There was still a desire for that free, cheapened labor. And so we see how the criminal legal system, in this case, jails, becomes a tool through which they can be re-enslaved, right? And so the critique that Angela Davis makes, W.B. Du Bois make is that we didn't have full Reconstruction, right? There wasn't an full incorporation of Black folks into the United States. It was a transformation of slavery, not an end of slavery. So the 13th Amendment states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. Slavery shall not exist in the United States except as a punishment for crime. So we see how that exception becomes really important in positioning Black people into carceral spaces, right? And then we also have segregation that lasts until 1964, Jim Crow segregation. With, and Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow is really popular, making that critique, right? But people have been doing this work, like I said, for a really long time. Angela Davis being one of the main folks theorizing, right? And so what we see after 1964, when Black folks can't be segregated in the same ways that they were before, de jure segregation is no longer allowed, what we see is that now Black folk become excess bodies in the United States because they can't be exploited in the same ways that they were exploited before this moment. And we start seeing that a response to that is an expansion of incarceration. How do you manage that excess number of bodies who are unemployed, right? We also have, you know, a lot of movement in terms of the economy, globalization, a lot of jobs going abroad, so on and so forth, right? So a response to that was criminalization, right? And by criminalization, what I mean by that is associating ideas of crime to particular bodies, particular communities. Crime is whatever the state says that it is, right? Crime is, so marijuana used to be a crime and now we're decriminalizing. Crime is whatever state says that it is. And it's used to target particular bodies. So the job of abolition is not done yet. That's the critique that abolitionists make, right? That we never fully abolished slavery and the prison system today is an extension to that. I know my time's up, so in the next session, I hope to take up the question of what does that mean for us at CSUN, right? What is our job? Thank you.
That is so fantastic and an excellent way to frame it, even though, of course, our heart is heavy about it. Thank you so much, Professor Escobar. Let's go ahead and go into Professor Lai.
Okay. I should start off by saying that I'm also a prison abolitionist, but I'm going to focus my comments on Asian American and Pacific Islander incarceration. I think when we think of the Asian American community, we tend not to associate it with incarceration. So that's one of the things I want to just touch on briefly, right? And that has to do in part with a image or stereotype of Asian Americans being a model minority, right? That, and this is something that dates the late 60s and has been re-articulated since then, right? And it's this belief that Asian Americans have succeeded economically in terms of educational attainment through being quiet, not radical, and through hard work, right? And it was an image that was created at a time to distinguish Asian Americans from so-called more vocal, more politically radical communities of color in the late 60s. So it was a wedge image that was meant to divide communities of color and to discipline African American and Latinx communities, right? And so there's this association that Asian Americans are somehow not problem minorities, right? And are not incarcerated, right? And that image hides historical criminalization of Asian Americans and incarceration, right? And it also hides contemporary incarceration, and particularly involvement of Asian Americans in detention, immigrant detention and deportation, right? And that's kind of where I hope to end up, and that's a lot to cover. But what I do want to point out, as far as historical criminalization is concerned, I mean, we do know that Chinese migrants early on were criminalized as being opium addicts, and that they were dangerous, diseased, right? That their communities they lived in were also dangerous and diseased and needed to be surveilled, right? And so they were the subject of law enforcement surveillance and also inspection by law enforcement and the public health department working closely together. We know that Asian Americans were criminalized for their migration. There was immigration exclusion, so they're detained at Angel Island Immigration Station off the coast of San Francisco, right? And so that the authorities could verify who they were, right? And we also know that part of the racialization of Asian Americans is that they are foreigners, right, and loyal to the nations that they come from. And that's that's a primary thinking behind the incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were American citizens, right? That they were loyal to Japan, and the federal government reclassified them as enemy aliens to incarcerate them. So there's a historical incarceration that I want to acknowledge. And then as far as contemporary incarceration is concerned, we tend not to see, there's the model minority image, but the other thing is states do not keep, and the federal government do not keep separate Asian American or Pacific Islander statistics for incarceration. And so Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are lumped together as others, right? And with Native Americans, with multiracial folks, with folks that have not identified their race or ethnicity, right? So you have to do a little, digging to try to figure out what's going on, right? And so those numbers are not huge, right? But researchers like Angela Oh and Karen Umamoto have pointed out that incarceration of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders during the decade of the 90s increased 250%, right? And they also furthermore pointed out that a number of these folks who were incarcerated are in fact of Southeast Asian descent. So they're children refugees. So there's a wave of refugees that comes in the 80s, right? And oftentimes being resettled in economically devastated communities, right? And so communities that are being surveilled, communities where there was heavy policing, right? And communities that where sometimes there was gang activity, right? And so it's that wave of Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians that were caught up in the incarceration, right? And so they're suffering from the trauma of the refugee experience. I think that's one of the things I want to emphasize. But the other thing is and this goes to something that Professor Escobar said, these are folks who are caught up in the wave of anti-crime legislation that's passing California and elsewhere, right? That's getting tough on crime, that's targeting serious, violent, so-called serious and violent crime, and so-called gang-related crime, right? And so these young Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander men are being sentenced under these anti-gang, anti-juvenile crime, anti-violent crime laws, right? And so what you see with the current incarcerated Southeast Asians and sorry about that, and Asian Americans is that they were sentenced as juveniles, tried as adults, right? And that they're more likely to be serving sentences where they have life without parole, right? After they get out, then because of changes in federal law, these are now deportable offenses. Actually, any crime where you served a sentence for a year or longer, the federal government has redefined as aggravated felony, right? That is a deportable offense. So these folks now are being put into the deportation industrial complex and being sentenced home. All right, thank you very much for your time.
See, what's really special about this is that so much I didn't know before, and especially I think my time at CSUN, I had very little exposure before to the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Very diverse, of course, a lot of different backgrounds there. But just in that 5 minutes, I feel like I took away a lot. Thank you so much for that. And if you ever have a chance to take a class with any of these people, I recommend. Let me go ahead and move to Professor Lorenz now.
Hi there. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. As I mentioned in my intro, I'm going to focus on sexual violence, but I'm also going to pivot a little bit towards more of the policing piece, which of course ties to our arbitrary, socially constructed, discriminatory laws and the conversation that needs to be had about prison abolition. But I also want to highlight that in terms of like recent events, a lot of the media coverage and conversation regarding police violence has focused on the brutality and homicides perpetuated against Black men like George Floyd and Black women like Breonna Taylor. And while these events remind us that Black women and other ethnic and racial minorities are subject to racial profiling, the use of deadly and excessive force, a lot of the conversation focuses on Black men. And not to say that that's a bad thing, but what I want to do in my time is I want to highlight how this connects to sexual violence, and particularly sexual violence perpetrated by police officers. So while events like of deadly and excessive force are certainly important events and are in a long history of police violence against people of color that we have to recognize and talk about and use to invoke structural changes in our system, I also want to highlight that we need to talk about other forms of police violence that are also primarily perpetrated against people of color. And sexual violence perpetrated by the police is the second most commonly reported form of police misconduct behind police brutality. And this is significant to note because anyone who's familiar with the crime of sexual violence, it's one of our most underreported crimes. So looking at sexual violence in general, less than a third of survivors report to the police. And they often don't report because they're fearful of further harm or retaliation from the perpetrator, fear of being blamed, or fear of not being believed. So imagine if this occurred and the perpetrator was a police officer. So when you think about being sexual assault being perpetrated by an officer, the reporting rate is likely very low. And so the fact that it's the second most common reported form of police misconduct, we can assume that this is happening fairly frequently, but people never report to the police for the reasons I just mentioned. So who do you report to when the person who sexually assaulted you is a police officer? And this is a clear example of how the crime of sexual violence takes place. It's a crime primarily perpetrated based on the need to exert power over another individual. And so the police in these crimes leverage their power to sexually abuse community members, primarily Black, Indigenous, women, and trans community members. So the reason why I think it's important that I wanted to bring up today is it's very much a racial issue, like police brutality, but sexual violence similarly has a long history dating back to slavery, Jim Crow, Black codes, but we've made very little progress in reducing the frequency of this harm and helping those who have been harmed. And it's very clear, and people have been having conversations about this for a long time, that we can't really make these changes without reforming our system. Because again, how do you report or get help for these crimes if the person who's perpetrating those crimes behind closed doors is an officer? So the issue of, I just want to check my time. So the issue of sexual misconduct, it's an issue of marginalization. It's not only race, although that's important to recognize, but it's also an intersectional crime where we have to consider intersecting identities like race and disability, where people who have physical or mental disabilities make up a third to a half of people killed by police, and also make up a substantial portion of people who are sexually abused by police. Sex workers of color are at increased risk for sexual violence perpetrated by the police, but often can't report. And the root of this is that our criminal justice system isn't set up to manage crimes perpetrated against people of color and other marginalized identities. It's not a broken system, but our system was designed to give the advantage to white, cisgender, heterosexual men. Regarding sexual violence, it wasn't until the Obama administration that we had a formal policy against prohibiting sexual misconduct against civilians. So even though we know this has been going on for a very long time, we didn't have any policies against it until just a few years ago. And there's still agencies without policies like this on the books. And even when there's no obligation to record or document or respond to these instances. And even if there were these numbers aren't reflected of the true magnitude of the crime, because so many survivors can't report when the police are the gatekeepers to the legal system and to the opportunity for legal justice. So without reforming our system, we can't expect to see much change that prevents and reduces the harm caused to Black, Indigenous people of color. And this isn't even specific to sexual violence perpetrated against the police, but that our legal system and police cause a lot of harm to sexual violence survivors in general. So I want us to consider in this conversation alternative reporting options that don't involve direct police contact. We need to require documentation, collect data of police perpetrated crimes, including sexual violence, and hold the officers truly accountable. But we also need to recognize that it's not just a few officers committing these crimes, but the system that enables this harm to take place in the first place, and allows that harm to take place particularly against women, men, LGBTQ individuals, sex workers, against people with disabilities, incarcerated persons, and that our system does nothing to prevent and repair this damage. So we need to have conversations about abolition, like the previous speakers have discussed, but also a restorative justice approach, rethinking what our laws are and how we can repair that harm and prevent future harm caused to victims.
Thank you for that, Professor. I'm so happy this is.
Hold on a minute.
Oh no, you're okay. Don't worry. I'm happy this is recorded because I just want to like take like an outline of like what you just listed, and it's fine that you definitely pivoted. That's why we have like, you know, different professors, departments represented, and also, yeah, I'll totally take criticism in that. Yeah, this event is called Fixing a Broken System, but yeah, perhaps the system, you know, oversight on my behalf. Yeah, it's not broken if it's working to design, correct? So,
I didn't mean to poke holes in the title. I just wanted to highlight that.
oh yeah, no, I know. I'm just already anticipating where students might feel a disconnect here, so I wanted to like explicate that. Thank you, Professor. Let me go ahead and now get Professor Labertoo.
Hello, everyone. So Professor Lorenz, it seems as though we probably should have coordinated a little bit, but that's okay, because I really want to invite those who are listening to recognize themes that are being raised in lots of different disciplines and in lots of different environments. And so I am gonna spend a little bit of time talking about the way that systems respond to victims of sexual and domestic violence, gender-based violence. And I'm also gonna spend a little bit of time talking about the ways in which gender becomes invisible in lots and lots of conversations around state violence. So you've heard folks talk about police violence and prison abolition. I'm going to use sort of this blanket term called state violence, which incorporates all of those pieces. And so I want to recognize Professor Paez gave us, thank you for acknowledging the land that we're on and that it is unceded. And so I want to acknowledge for folks who are Indigenous and others in this presentation that I am going to be speaking the names of people who are deceased. And so within about the first minute of my presentation, so you might want to consider that as we move forward. So and I did write myself notes because I can get tangential and sort of move off topic. So if I look down, I'm trying to stay on focus. So as in my 25 years as an advocate for survivors of gender-based violence and my more than a decade of work as a feminist professor, I've gotten certainly some insight into some areas that I'd like to share today. But ultimately, I think that my goal here is to begin really to engage in this critical dialogue around what is it that we do, really? How do we start to revision a system that, as I have in my notes, it is probably not broken. In fact, it is designed exactly to function the ways in which it is functioning. And so to really think about these two particular items that, you know, I sort of want to lay on the table for our consideration here, have to do with really, the first has to do with this awakening. I want to, you know, use air quotes, right? This great awakening for many people in the world, not for most of us who are on this webinar certainly, but for many people in the world, about the targeted state violence experienced by men of color, right? So this is apparently a very profound awakening for a lot of people, probably not the folks on the call. But what's important also to remember is that there is an invisibility of this type of violence targeted against both cis and trans women by the state. So whether it's within the context of prisons, there was a discussion about sexual violence within the context of prisons. Professor Escobar talked about prisons, but also at the hands of police. And so I want to just say the names of some women, right, who have experienced state violence and died at the hands of the police and others. Taisha Miller, Katherine Johnson, Aura Russer, Tatiana Jefferson, Kayla Moore. These are all names of people who were killed by the police that most of you probably don't even know and haven't heard of. And even Breonna Taylor's death didn't become a call to action until many, many months after right, it had occurred. And so I think that it's really important to remember that Black, cis, and trans women of color experiences with state violence are really rarely tracked or studied or looked at. There are certainly a few organizations following the Say Her Name initiative. The African American Policy Forum has Confined in California, which talks about women who are incarcerated. And then recently, a documentary actually that's premiering on PBS in November, which is called The Belly of the Beast, actually documents the intentional sterilization of incarcerated Black women in California prisons. By the way, that was only outlawed in 2014, right? So when we're talking about state violence and the impact on women of color, right? That's a really critical component. And here's the other issue, right? This creates a gap in our data. And what's missing even more than that is the experiences of Indigenous and Latinx women, right, who are being targeted by state violence. That's rarely documented. And so I think that those are really important things that we might want to consider as we consider this concept or idea of state violence and the system. The second sort of point, I guess, that I wanted to offer for our consideration here is this idea that when we begin to talk about criminal justice reform, or quite frankly, dismantling, right, of existing systems, oftentimes people who are promoting the status quo, who want to maintain those systems, use the experiences of survivors of sexual and domestic violence to suggest that if we abolish the current systems or dismantle them, that somehow their experiences would not be recognized, that there would be no sort of accountability, right? And so Professor Lorenz touched on this, and I think this is really important because first of all, this of course eliminates and makes invisible the experiences of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, undocumented victims of domestic violence and sexual violence who, right, some of whom had called on police to help protect them from those situations and ended up on the list of names that I read to you earlier. But also, just in general, when we think about victimization, I built a 25-year advocacy career around the fundamental idea that the criminal justice system doesn't work for victims. So put simply, I was a victim advocate because the system is not designed to actually work towards benefiting them. And so I think that this is a really critical piece of the conversation that continues to come up when we attempt to engage in conversations about dismantling existing systems, that this type, you know, victims of violence, what are we going to do if the system isn't available to them? The reality is that this system hasn't actually worked for them. And so I'm not really sure what it looks like to replace that. I think that, you know, we're going to begin to engage in a really important conversation around that. Certainly things like more advocates or mental health supports or even alternative methods of accountability, right? Professor Lorenz talked about restorative justice, there's transitional justice kinds of ideas that are put out there. But what is really important as we move towards these solutions is that this is a ground up, community up resolution, right? So we can all sit here and talk about this from the context of our professional expertise, but the people who really need to be part of this conversation are the people who are the most impacted about what it is actually that works for them. So I'll leave it there. And again, I invite the people who are listening to this webinar to not look at each of these presentations as sort of separate, but as connected really to each other in lots and lots of overlapping ways. So that's it for me right now.
Thank you so much, Professor Labertoo. I think that covered a lot, and I'll take the L on that for not already coordinating beforehand with both the criminology people we're going to talk about. That's fine. But I think you did really well on the fly, being second. Thank you. Let's go ahead and hear from Professor Hoganesk now.
Okay, hi again, guys. So I thought my talk would focus on public policy reform, the current discussion, but as I always emphasize when I teach these topics of public policy, our reforms should not be only informed by our experiences over the last year or 2 years, but rather they need to be grounded in some historical understanding of policing and the way it works in the United States. And so I thought I'd just give you a flavor of what I do in my classes. I stack the analysis with readings from different eras of American policing, beginning with the roughly 200 years of colonial experience, where policing is highly localized and highly fragmented. At its best, it's policing that is a little bit like the community watch system. At its worst, it's the vigilante style policing, sometimes brutal forms of justice, you know, lynchings and those kinds of things. But from this first period, what I tend to emphasize is that you have this extreme level of fragmentation of policing and almost a complete lack of oversight of higher levels of government. And that sounds pretty close to what we have still today. And so it helps us highlight some of the kind of institutional problems that you see with policing. And then, you know, as we go through the kind of early middle of the 19th century, we get more formal types of policing in the United States, bounty hunting, and then the policing of immigrants. And I highlight the fact that formal policing emerges directed at African Americans and immigrants. And then I say, does that sound familiar to you as well? The next major era that I look at in my classes is like the early 20th century, what is called bureaucratic policing, kind of the forerunner of today's modern police bureaucracies. They're extremely hierarchical, civil service rules, and of course, highly militaristic in the use of the types of weaponry, technologies, infrared cameras, helicopters, psychological profiling, and of course, specialized units such as SWAT teams. And it's here that I focus the analysis on the history of LAPD, because LAPD became the most bureaucratic and militarized of all of American police agencies in the middle 20th century. Under a chief called William Parker, LAPD becomes the big blue machine whose purpose is to protect the affluent communities of Los Angeles from the expanding underclass of Los Angeles. And of course, the 1965 riots only sort of serve to justify this style of policing, which is continued in the 1980s under perhaps an even more brutal regime of Daryl Gates. And it's not until we get to another crisis, caught on videotape. You see the historical connections here. And that, of course, is the Rodney King beating of 1991, which turns quickly into the LA riots of 92 when the officers are acquitted. And there's a whole backstory on that as well that I don't have time to go into. But it's really the Christopher Commission and this window of opportunity to try and change LAPD, to bring some greater accountability and to change the style of policing from military to community-based policing. LAPD is somewhat successful, I would say, in doing that. although community-based policing is a little bit hard to define, and so in that sense hard to implement. Sometimes it looks like broken windows and over-policing, particularly in minority communities. And now, given events of the last 4 months, I feel like I'm back in the early 90s now with another opportunity to reform policing in the United States away from this crime control policing toward more intentional efforts along the lines of social work policing, childcare, housing, food security, gang prevention, healthcare, particularly mental health. If somebody could throw up, let's see, it's Kira, maybe throw up the link to the USC study, UCLA study that came out yesterday. It's a public policy analysis. But let me end where I began, which is the realization that policing in the United States is extremely fragmented. There's no magic wand that we can wave at the national level or the state level. There are 18,000 police agencies in the United States. And if you want to reform policing, you got to do it one at a time. And that is not an easy thing to do. But the good news is that most pressure in the political system that activists can use is at the local level. You guys, most of you guys are here in LA. If you want to change policing in LA, this is the place to do it. Yeah, I wish you guys luck in your journey to do so.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. I had a brief call with him beforehand. He was like, I want to kind of talk about the history of it in this country, but how do you do that in like 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever? But I think he did an excellent job of giving us just the absolute Sports Center lowlights in this case. But I'm really appreciative for that. So thank you, Professor. Let's go ahead and move into Professor Graves now.
Click. There we go. Of course, Tom had to talk about history. I got to talk about geography. And so one of the things that I talk about in my classes is that there's this notion, American exceptionalism, that we somehow can't learn from any other country. And our criminal justice system has radical departures from what Tom, you're Dutch, right? And you sort of, but you see what's going on over in Europe, and some of those places are closing prisons down because they have a different system. And Americans were so bad at learning from anybody else. We've always got to do it our way. But you look at how we elect judges, district attorneys, and they always run on this sort of get tough on crime platform, which is a sort of racialized thing. Very often it's the fear of the other. Legislators do the same thing. Nobody's ever gotten elected on the get soft on crime platform. It's always the other way around. And we've been talking about sort of the intersectionality of all of this. And I represent a white guy from Appalachia, but also boy from a impoverished Appalachia. These are sort of the angriest group of people out there, because they're always the aggrieved white guy. I represent that cohort. The funny thing is that they suffer from this as well in many ways. That the incarceration rate from people from my hometown, white guys, is really pretty high. But it's funny how they don't, it's so difficult to get them to see themselves as victims of their own policy stances or their own politics. They don't see themselves as fellow travelers, but as something else. It's one of those baffling areas of political science or even psychology that I always found extremely exciting in graduate school. So that's one of those things that if there was a little more class solidarity on these things, that maybe it would be easier to move forward. but our political climate has made it difficult to do that. The other thing that I did want to spend a minute or so talking about was the data. Professor Labertoo talked about how, you know, we don't know what's going on, and I'm a data guy. I'm a sort of a big data guy, and data is just, it's terrible. Not only, yeah, you can't tell the identity of a lot of who's getting killed by the cops, or who the cops are, or what their identity is. So, you know, we've been doing all these mapping and data analyses, and just realized, gosh, they don't take down data at all, even in a place that's sort of data rich like Los Angeles or Portland or Seattle. Much of the rest of the country, you know, they're still doing these things on paper and pencil. There's just no data to be gotten, and it is hard to move forward with reforms if you can't really establish in any sort of systematic way what is actually going on. And so, gosh, we've had a hard time doing that. One of the big data sets that I would point you to that kind of connects the two things that I've been talking about is that Debbie Ma up in psychology and I worked together on a project where we went through 5 years of DA reports about police brutality. And so the elected, the district attorney, the Get Tough on Crime district attorney, is reviewing all of the officer involved shootings. And I think it was like 350, 400 reports we went through, and every single one of them, cops didn't do anything wrong. Even though sometimes it was pretty egregious what they did, and they were all sort of slid off. So we have this data-rich environment, but it's still a very difficult thing to do. You can read all of those if you want over at KPCC. They did the Freedom of Information Act and got it all taken care of. So that was my 5 minutes. And of course, like everybody else, I got 2 hours worth of material.
Hey, thank you, Professor Graves. Yeah, no, like that's the thing, like getting this all like down and dense is itself like a challenge, and I appreciate you for putting us onto those perspectives, and also bringing up, like, you know, like some people have worked on, like, what is this rainbow coalition that could look like when, you know, everybody maybe on class lines recognizes discrimination, right? I think that's super interesting. And shout out people from like Appalachia. I know our AS executive director is a West Virginia guy, so not too far from. Let's go ahead and hear from Professor Paez now.
All right, hello everyone. I'm a social worker and an educator, and so I'll just briefly share from that perspective. But first off, I just want to shout out to Get Love, who's an organization that's working to end homelessness in LA by supporting the most vulnerable neighbors through companionship, community housing, and advocacy. And if you're looking for an organization that's doing really important work, who believes that housing is a healthcare issue and healthcare is a right, then definitely support Get Love, and I'll put their information in the chat here as well. And I also want to begin by considering the words and thoughts of Huey Newton, who's one of the founders of the Black Panthers. And he said that for us, the true definition of power is not in terms of how many people you can control. To us, power is, first of all, the ability to define phenomena, and secondly, the ability to make these phenomena act in a desired manner. The power to define phenomena and make this phenomena act in a desired manner. So I would say that in my entire student career, maybe 90%, if not more, of readings, films, assignments, etc., were in complete solidarity with settler colonial, Eurocentric, Western, cis heteropatriarchal male, hearing, able-bodied, Christian, upper income level perspectives. That's straight up dominance. Another way to term this is coloniality. Coloniality is the reality that we are living in. It is the reality and the consequences of 500 years and counting of various forms of colonialism. Colonialism is only violence. It cannot be accomplished without genocide, enslavement, destruction of land, air, and water. It was colonizers and settlers who constructed the physical, geographical, and legal criminal justice system. Before they called it a criminal justice system, they called it reservations and plantations. and they set the terms and definitions for who is forced into those spaces. From the perspectives of the oppressed, though, it was straight up white supremacy, capitalism, Christian hegemony, cis heteropatriarchal violence. The power to define phenomena and make this phenomena act in a desired way. Maybe a more insidious, more violent trick was to reinforce what scholar and author of Red Pedagogy, Sandy Grande, refers to as colonialist consciousness. Basically, many of us have been socialized, nurtured, and supported in a colonialist consciousness in which we actively practice believing and devoting our lives to the philosophy and ideology of cops and robbers, good guy cowboys, bad guy Indians, of the Texas Rangers, of the 49ers, the rugged pioneers, the FBI and CIA agents, and of course, the ones we call founding fathers. The power to define phenomena and make this phenomena act in a desired way. Becoming a social worker was a great experience of learning of how to help folks. And simultaneously, it was a learning experience that expected us to uphold the codes of colonialist consciousness. People who are economically disadvantaged are people who can't be fully trusted. People with lived experiences with mental health are generally dangerous and need to be controlled. Queer-identified people, trans people, have been unfortunately and continue to be pathologized and criminalized through diagnostic codes and evidence-based treatment interventions. And when I first became a teacher, I did what a lot of us do. I used and applied the same methods of teaching that I had experienced, which meant that I implicitly and explicitly upheld criminality and carcerality. Punitive actions first, ask questions later. Good students, bad students. Bad students are lazy, they don't work hard, they're not motivated, they. Instead of looking at myself and the institution, like how can I be down with liberation and freedom movements, but practice a carceral colonial logic in the classroom or in the social work field. The power to define phenomena and make this phenomena act in a desired way. All of this is coloniality. All of this is violence. Looking at this dominating system as part of coloniality, as many of you have already said, we may begin to understand it as something that is in fact not broken, but well-oiled and effective colonial machinery. And so here's what I want to end with. Filipino historian and scholar Renato Constantino, he made an important critique about the US colonization of the Philippines. According to Constantino, he said that the most effective means of subjugating a people is to capture their minds. Military victory does not necessarily signify conquest. As long as the feelings of resistance remain in the hearts of the vanquished, no conqueror is secure. So what we're seeing on the streets, on our campus, in our classrooms, are the feelings of resistance that remain in the hearts of the vanquished, who are embodying and acting the words of Bob Marley in his song when he said, "Until the philosophy, which holds one race superior and another inferior, is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war, and thus no conqueror is secure." Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Professor Paez. I feel like I want the transcription of that. It's a lot I think I'll continue to think about. And that just reminds me in college when I was really only exposed to what coloniality was really, and for the first time in my religious studies class. That's part of the reason why I want to teach, is because I'm like, how come I didn't learn this, like basic social studies? Anyway, thank you so much. Let's move into, last but not least, our speakers, Professor Olmos.
All right. So I'd like to make 3 propositions regarding the criminal justice reform movement, given this unique historical conjuncture that we're in right now. The first one is that criminalization, courts, policing, prisons, all of those are critical elements or constituent elements of the twin forces of organized abandonment and organized violence located at the heart of racial capitalism. And so, this is a long history of racial capitalism in this country. Racial capitalism is a set of social relations that enshrine the inherent inequality of capitalism through race and racism. And so we've seen that from sort of settler colonialism to slavery, then later redlining, segregation, Jim Crow, the Bracero program, the illegalization of migrant labor, deportations of Latinx people and non-whites, to deindustrialization of American cities, right? There's a long history of this sort of racialized capitalism. And inherent to this racialized capitalism is uneven development. And one way to think about uneven development is the way Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about this, and she calls it organized abandonment. That is the systematic setting aside of people and resources. And this process of setting people aside and resources in ghettos or in detention or prisons requires and necessitates organized violence. This is state violence. So policing, prisons, deportations, evictions, and so forth. So criminalization in this regard plays a really critical role because it socially and politically authorizes organized abandonment and then eventually again, organized violence. And there's a long history of this from the slave patrols, the black codes after the emancipation, to the criminalization of communists and anarchists and union radicals in the early 1900s in industrial cities, the police regime of Jim Crow, later on into the law and order campaign of Nixon in the 1960s, and on now into mass incarceration. And interestingly, in this moment, after the 1960s urban rebellions, the Kerner Commission, which was authorized by the US government to explain what happened during the 1960s, called for a Marshall Plan for American cities, basically support and uplift communities of color and vulnerable communities. But unfortunately, that Marshall Plan turned into a massive job program to hire hundreds and thousands of new police forces and correctional officers and the militarization of the police. And so after that point, you also had a moment of deindustrialization during the 1980s, which disproportionately impact Black and brown communities, creating a situation of racialized surplus populations in cities that were then criminalized, policed, and then incarcerated. And so that leads me to the second proposition that I want to make, and that is reform of the criminal justice system, and the police specifically, is possible, but it's not effective or a desirable path. We must engage in a strategy of non-reformist reform. This is along the lines of a lot of critical resistance strategies. And what I mean by this is, so think about body cameras, implicit bias training, community policing, civilian oversight boards. These are all have not been effective in reining in the excessive racialized state violence of the police and the criminal justice system more broadly. These are reformist reforms. They purport to change the system, but in fact actually operate at the edges of the system and serve to ideologically justify the existing system, maintaining the status quo of organized abandonment that necessitates organized violence. So we're still in a situation where poor communities of color are over-policed and underprotected. And so this is where the defund the police approach is really quite instructive, because it demonstrates that many are calling sort of a non-reformist reforms, a set of practices and policies that challenge the existing structure, make it smaller, while looking toward meeting human needs, right? So the defund proposals seek to allocate resources away from the institutions of organized state violence toward community development, community needs through social supports, social welfare, jobs, etc. And so the criteria here is for the non-reformist reforms is, does the reform expand or does it try to dismantle the system or does it make it smaller, right? That's sort of what's also led people to think about sort of the reimagining of public safety and the community well-being that seek out restorative justice practices outside of the criminal legal system. Quite instructive and important. And then the last proposition I want to make is that non-reformist reform struggles against criminalization and racism must be connected to larger politics of downward redistribution. So these struggles to mitigate and dismantle the systems of organized violence must address the structures that actually create organized abandonment, right? That necessitate the violence. So the poverty that underlies all of this is at the root. So we need to redistribute resources. We're an extremely wealthy society, and we have to find ways to then redistribute that wealth downward. And I think these proposals of non-reformist reforms, like defunding the police, provide an opening to really think about the redistribution of resources downward. And so that means that the struggle for criminal justice reform needs to be linked up to these larger politics. For example, right now, unionization efforts, increased state social supports, progressive taxation, college and university healthcare as public goods, tenant rights, housing rights, homeless rights, living wage, all of these proposals that are part of a larger strategy for redistribution downward to the people. Thank you.
It's funny, like after lectures, I'll just kind of be sitting there like like silent for a second, like, oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Professor Olmos. I love the logic that you kind of like laid that out, and like other people have mentioned, seeing how sort of, if not interdisciplinary, interconnectedness of all these issues with broader things we wouldn't associate with it is fantastic. Let me also make sure, just Zoom procedure-wise, a couple of the professors have put some things that have just went to all the panelists. So that means the attendees can't see it, only like us can see it. So, but these are super cool thoughts, and I want the attendees to see as well. So it's up to you if you want to like resend it and just make sure you put all panelists and attendees. But we're also compiling this stuff, so don't worry. Anyway, okay, perfect, great. So that like transitions us to the next thing. Let me just go ahead and make sure I have my speaking notes, so all is well there. This is the portion now where we will let professors kind of respond to ideas they had heard before, in the efforts to make this a dialogue as best or as possible as it can be over Zoom, which might be a little clunky. So we're gonna have basically, we're saying 2 minutes, maybe 3, if you want to provide some thoughts on what had already been mentioned. I actually had not planned well how I would do this, whether it would be just through the order we had already established or at the will of professors, but I think I'm going to go ahead and we'll go down the list for sake of order, and I'll just see if anybody has any thoughts they want to add on and share. So we'll go ahead and start from the top of that list again. Professor Escobar, did you have any sort of extra things you wanted to add or respond to?
No, I just, yes, I just really appreciate everybody's work and everybody's work and thoughts on this. And I think there's a lot more community on campus than we realize that's concerned about these issues. So this is a really amazing space. So thank you for putting that together. I think a lot of, as I was listening, right, and I'm thinking about abolition and transformative justice. Of course, several of the panelists made the comment, alluded to this non-reformist reform, right? So some of the folks talked about carceral feminism, how relying on the state to deal with, for example, domestic violence or sexual violence doesn't actually make communities safer, actually often makes communities more vulnerable to violence. The idea that we perceive the state to be a protector and don't see, for example, the kind of violence, the searches, the violent searches that because they have a badge, they can touch your body, and that's not understood as sexual violence, right? And so we need to start changing the lens, which is a really important point that was made, I think. And also for CSUN, right? For CSUN, we spend over $2 million on police personnel. That doesn't include their equipment per year. That doesn't include their equipment. That doesn't include, you know, whatever programs and whatever they have, right? That's just personnel. And to me, it's like we have students that are houseless. We have students that are dealing with hunger. We have, right? And how can we start there? Why is it that CSUN has a jail on campus? Why is it that our students, you know, end up in some cases incarcerated? And if they end up incarcerated on a Friday, they don't come out till Monday, right? Why is it that we have that kind of space sorry, it keeps going off, on our campus, but we're not able to meet basic needs, right? So I think as a campus, I want us to think about how are the ways that we contribute to carcerality, right? We have contracts with the prison industry authority, right? Building, making things inside prison. Why is that the case? How is CSUN complicit in carcerality, and how can we start undoing some of the damage that we're doing right now? And so that's where I want, hopefully, the future conversation to go. We know what many of us, and hopefully after people attended today, know what the issue is. Where do we go from here? How do we start moving towards abolition, and what is that going to look like for us? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Escobar. I'll keep my comments to a minimum just to make sure we stay on time and we get to hear the most from professors. So let me go ahead and go to Professor Lai, if you have anything you want to sort of respond to.
I think that a number of the speakers have really highlighted, you know, the importance of incarceration of the prison industrial complex to our current form of capitalism, right? And I think Professor Escobar is getting us to take a good look, you know, locally at CSUN and who is CSUN, you know, contracting out with, what sort of corporations, and do these corporations, you know, have their hands, you know, their multi-million dollar hands, you know, in some aspects of the prison industrial complex, right? And at CSUN, can we then, you know, divest from these corporations, right? That's something that we need to consider, right? And I think that's my main comment at the moment.
Sure, thank you so much for that. Let me go ahead and move to, and yes, I am doing my best to listen to everybody. I just want to keep my comments to a minimum. Let me go ahead and move to Professor Lorenz, if there was anything you want to respond to or echo.
Yeah, just quickly, I want to say thank you to everyone for being here and sharing their perspectives and their work and everything. It's been really valuable for me. Yeah, I love what Dr. Escobar and Dr. Lai said about how we need to consider this in terms of CSUN and our allocation of resources, and that it's not just LA, but it's in our own home, in our own backyard, and how this connects to capitalism, and also how it connects to liability, which is also a part of the capitalistic agenda of institutions like higher ed. And CSUN's a wonderful institution, but we do need to look inward into some of these issues. And you know, regarding sexual violence, I want to say that this isn't only a policing issue, but we also have a patriarchal issue in terms of our Title IX organizations, where it perpetuates harm rather than doing more good. And that, again, ties back to liability and capitalistic agendas, creating the illusion of safety on campus when it's actually perpetuating harm and not doing anything to prevent these harms from occurring in the first place. So I just want us to think about those as well, and say thank you everyone for sharing. Oh, and one other thing, a few of us have brought up the concerns about data collection, and I just want to highlight that that is not a coincidence, that there's a reason why, for a lot of the reasons that we all spoke about today, why we're not systematically collecting data on instances of police misconduct, sexual violence, things like that. But we need to.
Thank you, Professor. It's very exciting to hear everybody kind of take away something from another professor, so that's great. Professor Hogan-esque, do you have anything?
Wow, I mean, I was blown away by all of these presentations. It reminds me how much I enjoyed being a student, and how being a professor, you're still a student. You're always a student. You're always learning. You're learning from your students. And yeah, guys, take advantage of the great faculty that we have on this campus, in this college. And in that spirit, I will cede the rest of my time to the students and their questions.
Fantastic. I know, I hope we do get some questions, or else I might even have to get creative and say, professors, let's quiz each other. But, or I'll come up with stuff. But we do have some attendees here to ask questions. Let me go ahead. Thank you for that, Professor. Let's, Professor Graves, if there was anything you wanted to respond to or echo.
Yeah, one of the things I kind of sort of forgot to say was that in my research, I found that there were significant differences within Los Angeles in terms of public safety, and that people could feel safe in their house without the most heavy hand of the police, and that some precincts were doing a much better job, it appeared, at not shooting up the neighborhood. And I think that we can, that the data can be dangerous, in that people like Bill Bratton used it the wrong way. But I'm hoping that it can be also used to make people safe and to reduce the state violence at the same time. And by looking at at not only how the Europeans are doing it, but different police departments, different communities, that it can be done, or at least it's being done better in some places. Which reminds me to invite you, any of you, if you guys have some data project that you're looking for. I have a team of students and we are looking for a project. And some of them are doing COVID-19 stuff, but I have some really smart kids, or students. Some of them aren't kids. In fact, none of them are. But we've got a team, and some of them are interested in these sorts of issues. So hit me up if you've got any big data challenges that you would like us to take a stab at. Thanks, guys.
So cool, because like, you know, if you wanted like research opportunities too, we're just handing them out. That's very cool. Thank you, Professor. And then Professor Paez, was there anything you wanted to echo or respond to?
First off, again, thank you, Michael, and thank you to everyone who helped organize this, and to everyone on this panelist, all the panelists and everyone here who's attended. It's really a powerful experience, honestly, to sit here and like Dr. Escobar said before, you know, there's more, I think we're recognizing there's more camaraderie and opportunities for collaboration here than sometimes we may even recognize. So I think that's important. I guess first I'll just get this out the way. Make sure you fill out your census information and vote. That would be great. And no matter what you feel, you know, I know now it's just being strategic is probably a good time to vote if you have that ability, because not everyone is able to do that. But I guess the other thing is I want to just say, and I referenced Bob Marley in my piece, and I want to just point out, like, this is a very difficult time. This is there are people dying, you know, regularly, and people are being exposed to this kind of violence, you know, regularly through Instagram, through YouTube and Twitter, all these things, and it's just nonstop, and it takes a toll on people, and that causes a lot of harm too. And in addition to what our president says and trying to, you know, all his rhetoric, I'm just saying that because I want to just bring into the fact that, like, there are people right now, maybe on this panel, who have been harmed or are being harmed. And that we need to figure out ways to take care of one another right now. And I think that there's a lot we could do in that with regards to practicing a different type of ethic of care and mutuality with one another, starting off with how we are with our students, starting off with how we are with how we are as colleagues, and really move away from a very colonial Western academic tradition that continues to be punitive with people instead of seeing everyone's humanity, instead of you know, really embracing our full interconnectedness that we all have, and in addition to with our environment. So I just want to say that because I feel like it's important that we all find ways to reach out and check in with one another and take care of one another during these times. So yeah. So, but again, thank you all for this really, really powerful space. I learned a lot today, so thank you.
Every time I'm just so grateful, one, for your contributions, and two, I feel the same way, and I'm so happy this is recorded because I'm definitely going to be watching this again, like really sitting there taking notes. This is very fantastic. I'm very happy for this. Last but not least, again, next time I do the order, I'll start it at the opposite way so that we don't always do this to you, Professor Olmos. But was there anything you wanted to echo or say?
Michael, I know you're going to Professor Olmos, but I didn't get a chance, so I'll go after him.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Professor. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, I'll be really quick. I just want to reiterate how critical a moment this is right now, historically speaking. You know, social movement scholars suggest that, you know, these big upheavals happen as a result of these major combinations of structural issues. Like, one, there's a real opening right now, right? The COVID crisis exposed the contradictions of the system that we're living in. And so there's a real opening there. And additionally, what's happening is that there's a culture of resistance that's gathering and a sort of liberation of the minds. And so these two forces are really opening up this moment. It's so critical to continue these conversations and continue to struggle and make proposals and extend our projects outward and make them more broad and scale up, because, you know, we may not be able to see this particular moment in history, you know, again, I don't know, maybe this we're kind of going through maybe a protracted level of crises, you know, every 5 years, but nevertheless, it's still a moment that we have to really take advantage of. And that we're really an interesting crossroads in history right now.
Cool, thank you for that, Professor. Professor Labertoo, I'm so sorry. I don't know how I did that. Maybe I saw criminology twice and I just...
Yeah, I'm sure. It's all right. I have no issue with making myself heard, so we're good.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, you know, everything that everybody said is really important. And there was one thing that I think that Professor Escobar talked about really early on that I think is important for us not to forget. And that is really expanding our understanding of what we mean when we talk about state violence, especially around immigration detention. So the reality is that internationally, it is not a crime to immigrate to a country. And so we have to understand that people have the human right to be able to move across borders. But when we create policies that criminalize that type of movement, right, it adds to this sort of expanded system of incarceration. And so, and the federal government does not, our current federal government and past federal governments don't recognize immigration detention, immigration detainees as prisoners, and so don't afford them the same rights and obligations often as we might afford those folks who are incarcerated through a process. So I just don't want to forget that, because it's part of this process of criminalizing things that are not criminal.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, the international perspective, I'm glad, was like brought here just to put us in context of the world. Like, yeah, this stuff is like kind of not good and like, you know, bottom tier. Very good. So let me go ahead and transition us into the student Q&A portion. So right now we don't have any questions logged from students yet. So if you're an attendee and you would like to post something, please go ahead and take the time to do that now. And then it'll take probably a moment for us to kind of like vet it once we get it, and then for me to get it, and then for me to ask it. But in any case, I'll be on standby. And so what I'll probably end up doing is jump in myself, and we might not take the whole 30 minutes just because we went over a little bit. I didn't like time in my own like responses in there, so we're a little over. But please, if you're a student, go ahead to drop something in there. Let me just go ahead and myself get creative with a question. Let me just make sure I'm also like paying attention to my outline and I'm saying everything I need to. Oh yes, and if you want to pose a question, please also address it to the professor you want, or if it's a general question, that's fine too. Yeah, all right. Let me get creative and jump in then. So there were a couple things I think that I heard echoed a lot by a lot of different people, which is cool, right? Like the fact that there isn't really so much dissension across disciplines, but like a sort of unity was exposed today, I think. Actually, you know what? I do have a question from a student. So let me take a pause on it. I basically just wrote a bunch of like things I kept hearing, but I'll come back to it. Let me read this question. It is from Alex Ojeda. So thank you for your contribution and asking, how can we introduce such concepts to students in the classroom when we have been conditioned to live in a police state? So I'll say that once more. How can we introduce such concepts to students in the classroom when we have been conditioned to live in a police state? I forget if my fellow panelists can like see this question or not. If not, and you may be able to, but if not, please, crew members, somebody drop this in the chat so they can see it too. But I'll go ahead and let anybody who wants to respond to that respond, and we'll kind of work it out from there. So you can just unmute yourself if you're a panelist and say something on it.
Well, I'm happy to just contribute something very minimally to that. And that is to really, you know, you have a small contingent of professors on today that were willing to talk about these kinds of things and probably do so in their classrooms. But it's sometimes risky in an institution, right, to have these kinds of conversations that ask us to consider whether or not we should be dismantling institutions, like asking questions like, why are the, you know, desks in our CSUN classrooms made by incarcerated people in the state of California? And so I think that, you know, one of the ways to get this information to the classroom is to, number one, really encourage your professors that these are the kinds of concepts you want them to talk about, and then talk about that in the institution as a whole, right? So, you know, hey, you know, there's these really, you know, sort of radical ideas that are being presented in classrooms, because it's very easy for these radical ideas to get sort of covered by the institution. So I would really, you know, as students, you have a lot of power in that respect.
Thank you for that. And yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic to send to the students again in that. I'm sorry, I'm also just making sure I have enough time for our last like sort of closing thoughts portion. And unfortunately, Professor Hoganess had to leave us. Thank you so much though. I'll publicly say that now for him. I just want to make sure, okay, so I just need 20 minutes for the closing portion. And so I'll let the Q&A portion go on for another 10 minutes or so. And seeing as how there are no more student questions, I'll jump in. I think I'm really interested in the academy as a place, or like college as a place where these movements have been institutionalized. If we think back to, you know, the movement era and the civil rights era, we built a lot of ethnic studies departments, maybe if not many, at least at CSUN we do have some. And but even in other departments, I think you feel the influence of it. And so I guess I'm just interested in what role do you see yourself as a sort of academic in participating in these larger movements? I don't know, this is like a nerdy question perhaps, but unfortunately it reflects like kind of what I'm interested in learning. But I am interested, like as a professor, what do you see your role as in all this? And so I guess I'll leave it kind of like broad-ended there. You can respond however which way you see. I'll go ahead and let whoever wants to take it on unmute themselves.
All right, if no one wants to jump in, I'll jump in. Okay, so I don't think, I mean, I love that question. And I think it's a really important question for us to think through, you know, again, what our role is as teachers. And I think one thing I'm trying to think through is the idea of authority versus authoritarian. And I think like when I first started, I was probably, you know, I was a basketball coach for a long time. And a lot of my basketball coaching was authoritarian, like run, jump, pass the ball, do this, we're gonna run this offense. And you know, that works in some settings, but it's really not a healthy style of leadership really anywhere, I don't think, and especially in education. And so I think for me, throughout my career, I really tried to shift out of that, unlearn those colonial strategies, and instead try to embrace the interdependence, anti-colonial methodologies, relational accountability, and to see how the relationships that we could develop with students, with colleagues, and with community members can work to develop a classroom learning community that is rooted in healing, that is rooted in critical analysis and critical thinking and reflection and discourse. So So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's, I guess, kind of the way I see the classroom space.
Oh yeah, super helpful. I also, I want to teach K through 12. That's my like end up goal. And so as I'm beginning to learn about pedagogy and all these things, right, I'm also being exposed to like, yeah, you might feel like once you're in the classroom that you have to be this authoritarian figure that you like have seen on TV and stuff, who's always like super like hard on the discipline to like, you know, get these like urban youth to like, you know what I mean, perform at a high level. But I'm learning too, like there's so much damage done by doing that, right? And you replicate all this oppression in the classroom. Yeah, thank you, Professor. It's definitely another professor can interrupt me if they want to contribute, but I do see I have a student question, so I'll get to it.
Actually, Michael, I wanted to say that because I'm trained in ethnic studies, I mean, ethnic studies is a discipline that comes out of political movement, right? It's a discipline in the service of a political movement that was beholden to communities, right? And I take that very seriously in my teaching and what I teach, right? And how I relate to my students, right? The sorts of outreach I do to community organizations, I always feel like I don't do enough, right? And it weighs on me. So I think that's one thing I wanted to say. You know, as far as Alex's question about how do we teach about prisons, it's sometimes not easy, right? I approach it several ways, but I also, primarily I try to historicize where did the riots in prisons come from, right? And it's not just the war on drugs, right? And I try to situate it in a change in the late 20th century where we moved away from a form of government that you know, had some social spending to one where you know, there's less and less of it, right? And where incarceration then becomes the social spending, right? So I try to get the students to think in terms of political economy, right? In terms of like, you know, how do we understand how if you went through public school, how your K through 12 education, how it got defunded, right? And how your experience in the CSU system got defunded, right? And so I try to get students to think in terms of political economy. I try to get students to think in terms of the sorts of stories that these dog whistles that opinion makers, politicians, and think tanks were using to create these moral panics around you know, gang-related crime, around drugs and that sort of thing, right? That sort of inured, you know, folks to social conditions and communities, right? So that's kind of how I approach it. And I also try to talk about incarceration and how it's spread, you know, to immigrant detention, deportation, right? It's spread into schools. So a lot of students are well aware of the presence of LA Unified Police, you know, or LAPD in their schools, right? And so that's how I try to connect things. It's not always successful, I think, a lot, you know, but I think you know, I think it does make some inroads.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. And like that, when I was posing the question, I was thinking explicitly of like ethnic studies, but I also realized people go into other disciplines too, sort of with maybe with an ethic that's at least adjacent to it. So I appreciate that, and yeah, all that context is super relevant and helpful. And I had to learn for myself. Shout out my partner Christina, who's watching. I think is always telling me like, you know, you're only human, right? You can only do so much yourself. So, and you do a lot, Professor Lai. So thank you. Your efforts are recognized. Let me go ahead and hear from a student who asked. Evelyn Jimenez, who's actually in AS with me. She's our chair of elections. So thank you for watching, Evelyn. How is Marvin doing? That's just a little joke for her. Anyway, she asks, what are the best ways to contribute to our communities to ensure that we end police violence? I believe it can be done, but sometimes it feels like such a big issue. I don't know where are the best places to start. So I'll say that once more. What are the best ways to contribute to our communities to ensure that we end police violence? I believe it can be done, but sometimes it feels like such a big issue, I don't know where the best place to start is. And same rules as last time. Anybody who wants to respond, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's so complex, right? And I would just want to contribute to that conversation to say that you know, the sort of racial understanding of policing is very malleable. Indeed, it is the case that white supremacy sets up a system that then polices people of color. But in a place like Los Angeles, it's really interesting because we have some of the most diverse police forces in the LA area, right? So I would say that, you know, we have to also attend to the ways in which Latino masculinity, thinking from my own perspective, gets recruited into police power, and as a form of sort of an ideological sort of investment into these systems of power. So, you know, it's important to think about what's happening with the sheriff's department right now. In South LA, there's been a lot of police shootings, and the perpetrators of those shootings are not white sheriffs, right? They're Latino sheriffs. So we have to have a framework that understands these racial logics as really complex and not just kind of black and white, or, you know, there's whites and there's people of color. We have to think about, yes, the racial capitalist system is organized around white supremacy, but is able to recruit people of color into these systems of organized violence. And so we have to have that critique and have those conversations in our own communities, because I think, you know, that's at the end of the day, it's going to kill us if we can't have an analysis of those complexities.
I would like to add, because I think her question is, what can you do? I mean, we're here as a bunch of experts, right? And a student is asking, what can they do? And my first response is, it's overwhelming. And it feels, you can feel extremely helpless. And I feel that way about a lot of things. This, climate change, COVID-19. I always try to tell myself and my students, do your part. At least do that. And you're attending this, so you're getting informed, which is the first step. You know, that knowledge is power. And then you can go from there. The least you can do is vote as an informed citizen. And then you can push harder, be an activist, run for Congress, become a college professor, and then you can try to multiply what you do. There is a lot of things you can do. The worst thing is to just say, it's so overwhelming, what can I do, and give up. But you've started, you're asking questions. It's brilliant.
So oh, go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, are you sure?
Yeah, I'll go after you.
Okay, I just want to say that also thinking from the research and data perspective, that if we're thinking about defunding the police and you know, eventually dismantling the criminal justice system as is, right? The question is, where do we then put the resources that we're divesting from our criminal justice system? And Professor almost touched on this a little bit, but we also have to think about the cultural needs of the community. So if we want to dismantle the patriarchal structure of our criminal justice system, we have to collect data. We already have, you know, some research documenting this, but we also have to consider the cultural needs of our community and what resources they are most likely to use. So we can't say, well, let's put all of our money towards schools, although I think that that's a good choice, but also or social workers or therapists. You know, those are also options that are on the table. But we have to think about if there are communities who are comfortable and willing to use those resources, because again, we don't want to reproduce a system where people don't want to go to it for help.
And I'd like to, I think, just add another piece to the conversation related to like, what can we do when things are so overwhelming, when there's so much need? and certainly related to police violence, but I think that all of us probably could look around and think there's so much need. And so I teach an advocacy class, and one of the things that we talk about is focusing, first of all, finding something that really you're passionate about. So, you know, we've talked about a lot of different issues within the context of state violence. So there might be something that really interests you. To finding organizations that are doing that work. Professor Paez, right at the beginning, talked about some organizations that are doing really important work in these areas. But also don't underestimate, you know, what is really a kitchen table conversation, right? To take words directly from the mouths of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Those people that you have influence over, that you come in contact with every day, who, and I think that this is so important for us from a criminology and criminal justice perspective, and we hear it all the time, right? Conversations about, you know, yeah, but not all cops are bad, right? To have these really direct personal conversations about that's not what's being, right? That's sort of diverging from the real point. And so to really engage in very personal conversations around things that are important to you that help to educate people about the reality of circumstances. That could be your friend in class. It could be, you know, your grandparents. It could be somebody you work with. It doesn't have to be huge, right? From somebody who's spent 25 years doing work around advocacy, trying to change systems, sometimes it doesn't have to be huge. It can really just be small.
Thank you, Professor. Let me just, so we have a few questions up too. Let me go to the one I got first, and the student wish to remain anonymous. Our time is, okay, actually, you know what? Let me actually pivot. Let me actually get this one because it's directed at a specific professor, and then we'll round it off with that last question. So this one is posed to Professor Paez. Often social workers are viewed as part of the problem. Therefore, how does this role of social workers help bring change rather than contribute to the institution?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking it. And that's a question I think a lot of us as social workers are trying to grapple with and think through. In addition, along with the people that utilize the services, and also along with our students. What I can say is that social work history globally has been explicitly connected to maintaining all these systems, removing indigenous kids, removing Black kids, removing kids of color at disproportionate rates. And really, I would say acting in a disconscious state. That's what, that's like, you know, yes, you recognize there's inequity, but you just keep participating in it. And so I think shifting out of that is one of the things. But I also want to say too that there are lots of social workers and teachers and organizations that have taken a much more radical stance and for a long time, and have practiced liberatory types of healing, have aligned themselves with, you know, very radical, very progressive movements, and are doing some of that work. Unfortunately, their work doesn't always get amplified to the same level or get funded to the same level. So they struggle in that way. So I think that's a really good question. I guess I want to add to one other thing to the previous question. Instead of thinking, you know, obviously thinking big is so overwhelming, but also knowing that as we're trying to deconstruct or dismantle, we can also build. So like one of the things that Grace Lee Boggs said was the best thing or the most radical thing I did was to stay put. And that included like building a community garden, or developing or getting to know who your neighbor is, or learning how to have a better, more equitable relationship with the people around you. Or it's like she said, put the neighbor back in the hood, you know? And I think that there's a lot to learn from how we can do things interdependently with folks, how we can connect with folks. And I think that's a really powerful way to decolonize, or a way to deal with a lot of this violence, is actually through the healing one another. So, yeah, but thank you, both of you, for those questions.
Thank you for that response, Professor. I will definitely get to this one last question, and I'll check with our support crew if they feel like we have time to close the event out still after that with another question. And the student wished to remain anonymous, but they voiced that they actually wanted to address this to Professor Graves. They said that while society is trying not to discriminate against minorities, aren't we now discriminating against who we call the majorities? For example, employment. So I'll read that again. While society is trying not to discriminate against minorities, aren't we now discriminating against who we call the majorities? Employment. So I guess however Professor Graves wants to respond to that, feel free.
Well, there's lots of discrimination against lots of people. And I suppose as the representative white guy on the panel, it's complex in that how you would calculate or discriminate or calculate what constitutes discrimination. And so I can't really answer that unless, you know, what employment discrimination is I suppose something that you could argue that does happen, but that's you know, a really complex and a large sort of question that I don't think that you could answer in in 2 minutes. Generally, I would just suggest that it may happen, but in the grand scope of things, it's not a it's not something that I'm concerned about in any massive kind of way.
Thank you, Professor. Let me, event staff, we have just about the perfect amount of time to jump into closing, but I know we have one last question. So do you think that we should just go into the conclusion and then offer the student like an email resource? Here, I'm deferring to my crew because this has been a long event. Thank y'all for like slugging it out with us, and I really don't want to make this longer than it needs to be. Cool. So we're going to the end, and hopefully we can get that resource over to the student. Thank you all for this. Let me pull up my notes. Thank you, Professor, for these contributions. I think we have like more than an excellent starting point. This has been for real a crash course, and I'm super happy for it. So with all that data out there, I wanted y'all to provide us with some parting thoughts, maybe directed at the students, just about, you know, what's maybe the most important thing to cut through here. We have time for like a minute and a half each, so really just like parting thoughts, last words. And if you wanted to touch on recommended readings, you could do that now. I said you kind of already did that throughout the event, so that's fine too. Whatever you feel like you want to leave. And we'll do this reverse order. So Professor Olmos, if you have any parting thoughts.
Well, I guess I just want to reiterate that we are living in interesting times. It is a structural opening, as I mentioned before, and don't be afraid to kind of step outside your comfort zone and risk a little bit, right? Get out there. Not only, you know, doing the sort of the regular kind of civic involvement, but go even further than that, right? Find an organization somewhere to be a part of that's really doing something that meets your needs. You know, now a lot of these organizations or groups are kind of meeting online, so you can do that through, you know, the internet. But this is really a moment of sort of a renaissance for civic engagement and real sort of deepening of our culture and sort of just, yeah, I think that's really the takeaway for me. This is a real opening, and take advantage of that opening.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Paez, do you have any closing thoughts?
Just once again, to say thank you, to you all for doing this. It's a real honor, honestly, to listen to all the different professors, to you and all the people who ask questions. And I think I would echo Professor or Dr. Olmos' comment about getting involved in different organizations. But in addition to that, I would suggest, looking at who is the local tribes in your area, and look to connect with them during this time as well. because oftentimes when we talk about these kind of practices, indigenous people or Black-owned companies or what have you end up becoming, dismissed or missed in some ways. And so, supporting Black organizations and businesses, looking at local tribes, I think would be also really important to do this. And wash your hands, stay 6 feet away, wear a mask, please, and take care. And also feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'd be glad to talk with you and share other ideas. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let's go ahead and bounce to, and I'm going to make sure not to skip anybody, Professor Graves.
This has been great. I didn't realize, it's refreshing to see some of the people who I know that are involved in what we do, but there are several new folks that I have not met, and I'll probably track you down at some point on campus and start asking you questions, Daniel. And hopefully we can work together and combine forces.
Like a Megazord from Power Rangers. Very cool. Okay, let me bounce to Professor Oganes had to leave, but I'll probably follow up with him later. Professor Labertoo.
Okay, I was confused by the order at this point.
I'm sorry, I'm just
that's
doing
okay.
reverse.
No, you're fine. I was waiting for Katherine to go. I don't want to really close with my own words, but I did want to share a quote from Black revolutionary and scholar Angela White Davis, who was recently interviewed on Democracy Now! And asked about sort of what we need to be thinking about in these times. And so she said, what we're calling for is a process of decriminalization, recognizing that threats of safety, threats of security come not primarily from what's been defined as crime, but rather from the failures of institutions in our country to address issues of health, violence, and education. So abolition is really rethinking the kind of future that we want, and it's about revolution. And so I think that's a really important place for me to leave my piece.
Fantastic scholar. Thank you for that. Let me bounce to Professor Lorenz.
I just want to say thanks again. This has been a wonderful panel. AS, everyone, you did a great job. Michael, you did a fantastic job facilitating. It's been great to be a part of it. I hope that there was some valuable information here for the students. It certainly was valuable for me. And I know it can be overwhelming. There's so many problems and they're so intertwined, and the more you learn, the more you see more issues. But hopefully that's a catalyst for you to jump in and use your career and your education to invoke change in that and use your voice. And like others have said, try to get involved in community organizations, reach out to others, learn more about these issues by listening to the lived experiences of others. In reading and writing and research and talking with people in your community. There's so many ways that you can get involved and learn. And that's one of the best parts of college, is being able to go to events like this and broaden your perspectives and talk to people and learn. So you guys are already doing that by being here today. So thanks again for involving us in it. It's been an honor.
The honor is all mine. Thank you so much, Professor. Let me hear from Professor Lai.
I wanted to close with some resources on Asian American and also Pacific Islander incarceration. I didn't really say that much about Pacific Islanders, but in the state of Hawaii, they represent about 40% of the prison population. That's overrepresented. And we don't necessarily know about that. And I think that we have to think about Pacific, we have to contextualize that within context of colonialism and the violence of colonialism. One resource on that is a documentary called Out of State. It's by a Native Hawaiian filmmaker named Sarah Lacey. We may be trying to invite Sarah Lacey to at least give a talk next semester. And a lot of the inmates in Hawaii are sent to the mainland and to serve out their sentences. And oftentimes they can be in places that are run by private corporations, right? Private prison corporations. in places like Utah or Texas, for example, right? So that's what Out of State is about, and that documentary focuses on the cultural resource groups that Pacific Islander inmates formed to survive the process, right, and to decolonize, right? And that reminds me of something that Professor Lorenz said about, what cultural resources do our communities need, and inmates, Pacific Islander inmates, are doing that, in California, in private, privately run prisons, right? As far as Asian American inmates, and they also work with Pacific Islander inmates here in California. There's the Asian Prisoner Support Committee. They run a program in San Quentin and also in Solano State Prisons called Roots, in a sense for restoring our own true selves, our original true selves. And again, that's, they center, the importance of knowing your own history, right? And to survive, to decolonize, to understand refugee trauma, to understand the impacts of colonialism for Pacific Islanders. And so that's a good resource to look into. If you're interested in deportations, the issue of deportations for Southeast Asians, and again, I want to emphasize the federal government changed the law, right? They created a category known as aggravated felonies, right? That's any crime with a sentence of a year or longer is aggravated felony. It could be a misdemeanor, could be a felony, and those are deportable offenses now. And so you have about 17,000 Southeast Asians, Cambodians, Laotians, Vietnamese, who have been given final deportation orders, right? And so there is a lot of resistance against this, and you can contribute your time to some of these organizations that are organizing around this issue, like Khmer Girls in Action, that's here in Long Beach, right? There's also Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, which is in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. We will be inviting the acting executive director for Southeast Asian Resource Action Center to give a talk in November, in the middle of November. And so there are a lot of resources out there, lots of folks who are organizing around these issues.
Thank you so much, Professor. And actually, Professor Escobar had to go early as well. But we made it, everybody. This has been, I think, a really intense, 2.5 hours. And I'm so appreciative for everybody who tuned in, everybody who stayed, everybody who asked questions and just learned with us. I want to go ahead and do my thanks now. Thank you, professors, because y'all were the literal, what a showcase, right, of what we have at CSUN, right? This little humble state school that is so freaking powerful, the jewel of the San Fernando Valley, 818 all day. Thank you so much for all your contributions. It was incredible. Thank you to everyone who attended. Yes, thank you for being there intense over Zoom. We appreciate you. And if you're watching this later online, thank you too. Thank you to my AS crew. Thank you to the people who helped me conceive this, Liz and Sahara. Thank you so much. Patrick, Leanne. Thank you, Kira, Chris, Tim. And thank you to all the producers. Thank you, Denise. Thank you to all the AS producers as well who have been working this event. The crew are always the unsung heroes, and they made this thing go smoothly, and they really coached me through it. And I'm just so appreciative. Last thing, Kira is going to drop an AS awareness survey in the chat, so take that out and fill it out if you have a moment. And on that, the event is over. Tune in tomorrow, same time slot, 4 to 6:30 for the student-oriented event, where we're going to have these conversations with students and ask some questions to see what AS can do for you in the short term and long term. But with that, the event's over, and I'm so grateful to everybody. You're all free to go. Please take that survey if you're a student.
Thanks, Angele and Jessica. You guys.
Oh my God, the interpreters. Well, how could I forget? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Everyone, take care.